The rain was coming down hard that Tuesday morning when Victoria Williams stepped out of her sleek black car at the airport. Most people would have expected the owner of one of the country's fastest-growing airlines to arrive in style, maybe through a private entrance or in her personal jet. But not today. Today was different. Victoria pulled her simple gray hoodie tighter around her growing belly and grabbed her small carry-on bag. At 7 months pregnant, every movement required a bit more thought and care. She looked just like any other traveler heading to catch a flight. That was exactly what she wanted. For the past 3 years, Victoria had built Skyward Airlines from a small regional carrier into a major player in the aviation industry. She had worked 18-hour days, fought for every route, and earned respect in a business where few people looked like her. But success had brought its own challenges. Lately, she'd been hearing concerning reports from passengers about the service quality on some flights. Customer complaints had been trickling in through various channels. Some passengers mentioned rude flight attendants, others talked about feeling unwelcome or treated differently. The feedback bothered Victoria more than she let on during board meetings. She had built her airline on the promise of treating every passenger with dignity and respect. Standing in line at the check-in counter, Victoria watched how her employees interacted with customers. The ground crew seemed professional enough, though she noticed one agent seemed impatient with an elderly man who was having trouble with his boarding pass. She made a mental note to discuss customer service training at the next staff meeting. "Next in line," called out the gate agent. Victoria approached the counter with her printed boarding pass. She had deliberately booked herself in coach under her maiden name, Williams, rather than her married name that appeared on all the company documents. The young woman behind the counter barely looked up as she processed Victoria's documents. "Traveling alone today?" the agent asked, glancing at Victoria's belly. "Yes, just a quick business trip," Victoria replied with a smile. The agent handed back her ID and boarding pass without much interest. Victoria appreciated the efficiency, but wondered if this was the kind of impersonal service that was becoming too common across the industry. Walking through the terminal, Victoria observed everything with fresh eyes. The gate areas looked clean and well-maintained. The digital displays were working properly, and announcements were clear. These were the basics her operations team handled well, but the real test would come once she was on board the aircraft. Flight 447 to Denver was scheduled to depart from Gate C-12. Victoria found a seat near the boarding area and pulled out her tablet. To anyone watching, she looked like just another business traveler catching up on emails. In reality, she was reviewing the latest performance reports for the Denver route. The numbers told an interesting story. While on-time performance was good and safety records were excellent, customer satisfaction scores for this particular route had been declining over the past 6 months. Several comments mentioned issues with cabin crew attitude, but the reports were vague and hard to act upon. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin boarding Flight 447 to Denver in just a few minutes," announced the gate agent. Victoria looked around at her fellow passengers. There was a businessman typing furiously on his laptop, a young couple sharing earbuds and watching something on their phone, and a family with 2 small children who were getting restless. These were the people who trusted her airline to get them safely to their destinations. They deserved better than just safe travel. They deserved to feel valued. As boarding began, Victoria noticed how the gate agents interacted with different passengers. They were polite with the first-class passengers, professional with business travelers, and somewhat rushed with families and economy passengers. The differences were subtle but noticeable to someone looking for them. When her boarding group was called, Victoria gathered her things and joined the line. She had specifically chosen a middle seat in the back of the plane, the kind of seat that would give her the most authentic passenger experience. If there were service issues, they would be most apparent in economy class. Stepping onto the aircraft, Victoria was greeted by a flight attendant who seemed genuinely friendly. The woman's name tag read Patricia, and she welcomed each passenger with what appeared to be a sincere smile. This was encouraging. But as Victoria made her way down the narrow aisle, she noticed another crew member near the middle of the cabin who had a very different energy. This flight attendant, whose name tag said Derek, seemed annoyed by the boarding process. He stood with his arms crossed, barely acknowledging passengers as they struggled to find their seats and stow their luggage. Victoria's seat was in row 23, between a window passenger who was already asleep and an aisle seat that was still empty. Getting settled while 7 months pregnant was no easy task, especially in the cramped confines of an economy row. She tried to lift her carry-on bag into the overhead bin, but the weight and her growing belly made it challenging. The bag was heavier than she'd remembered, and she didn't want to strain herself or risk any harm to her baby. Looking around, Victoria hoped to catch the attention of a crew member who might offer assistance. Derek was nearby, organizing something in a service cart, but he seemed deliberately focused on avoiding eye contact with boarding passengers. "Excuse me," Victoria said politely. "Could you help me with my bag?" Derek looked up with an expression that suggested he'd been interrupted from something very important. His eyes took in Victoria's appearance, her simple clothes, her pregnancy, her coach seat, and his expression shifted to something that looked almost like annoyance. "The bins are pretty full already," he said without moving to help. "You might need to check that at the gate." Victoria looked at the overhead bin above her seat. It was barely half full with plenty of room for her small carry-on. She wondered if Derek simply didn't want to help, or if there was something else influencing his reluctance. "I think there's room," she said gently, trying to maintain a positive tone. "I just need a hand lifting it up." Derek sighed audibly as if being asked to do his job was a major inconvenience. Other passengers were starting to notice the interaction, including an older gentleman across the aisle who looked like he might offer to help instead. As the plane filled up and more passengers settled in, Victoria began to understand why customer satisfaction scores had been declining. The difference in how crew members treated passengers was stark. While Patricia and another flight attendant named Lisa were consistently helpful and professional, Derek's attitude created an uncomfortable atmosphere that affected everyone around him. Victoria fastened her seatbelt and took out her phone to make some notes about her observations so far. She planned to document everything about this flight experience, from the ground service to the in-flight experience. As the owner of the airline, she had the power to make changes, but first she needed to fully understand what her customers were experiencing. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers and giving the standard pre-flight announcement. Victoria settled back in her seat, knowing that the real test of her airline service was just beginning. The airplane was now fully loaded and pushing back from the gate. Victoria had managed to get her carry-on into the overhead bin with help from the gentleman sitting across the aisle, since Derek had walked away without offering any assistance. The kind passenger, who introduced himself as Robert, was a retired teacher traveling to see his grandchildren. "Some people just don't want to do their jobs anymore," Robert whispered to Victoria as they watched Derek roughly handle another passenger's request for a blanket. Victoria nodded, but didn't say much. She was too busy taking mental notes about everything she was witnessing. This flight was turning into an eye-opening experience about her own airline service standards. As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign turned off and the cabin service began. Victoria watched carefully as the flight attendants moved through the aisles. Patricia and Lisa worked efficiently and smiled genuinely at passengers. They remembered drink preferences and checked on people without being asked. Derek, however, seemed to be having a completely different experience. He moved through his section with obvious irritation, slamming the drink cart into seats and huffing when passengers asked questions. Victoria noticed that he seemed particularly short with families, elderly passengers, and anyone who didn't fit his apparent idea of a preferred customer. When Derek reached Victoria's row, she decided to test the waters. "Could I have some ginger ale, please?" she asked politely. "And maybe some crackers if you have them. I'm pregnant and feeling a little queasy." Derek barely looked at her as he poured the drink. "We only have pretzels in economy," he said curtly, dropping the cup on her tray table so roughly that some of the soda spilled. Victoria looked at the mess on her tray and then at Derek, who had already moved on to the next row without offering to clean it up or providing napkins. Robert handed her some tissues from his personal pack, shaking his head in disapproval. "Thank you," Victoria said to Robert, then called out to Derek. "Excuse me, could I get some napkins?" Derek stopped his cart and turned around with an expression that suggested Victoria had just asked him to perform surgery. "They're in the seat pocket," he said dismissively. Victoria checked the seat pocket and found it empty except for the safety card and airline magazine. "There aren't any napkins here," she said. "Then you'll have to wait until I come back around," Derek replied, his voice getting louder. Other passengers were starting to turn and look at the exchange. A woman in the row behind Victoria leaned forward. "I have tissues if you need them," she offered kindly. "That's very sweet of you, thank you," Victoria replied, accepting the tissues. She was starting to understand that Derek's behavior wasn't just unprofessional, it was creating a hostile environment that was affecting multiple passengers. About an hour into the flight, Victoria needed to use the restroom. Getting up while pregnant on a plane was always a bit of a production, and she moved carefully down the aisle. As she returned to her seat, she found Derek blocking the aisle while he organized items in the galley. "Excuse me," Victoria said politely, waiting for him to move so she could get back to her seat. Derek looked at her with obvious annoyance. "You need to wait," he said, not making any effort to step aside. Victoria stood there for a moment, her back starting to ache from standing in the cramped aisle. Other passengers were watching the interaction, and she could see people starting to pull out their phones. "I just need to get back to my seat," Victoria said calmly. "I'm pregnant and it's difficult for me to stand in the aisle. Everyone thinks pregnancy gives them special privileges," Derek said loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "You should have thought about that before you decided to fly." The comment hit Victoria like a slap. She had built her entire business on the principle that every passenger deserved respect and dignity. To hear one of her own employees speaking this way to anyone, let alone a pregnant woman, was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Robert stood up from his seat. "That's completely inappropriate," he said to Derek. "She just needs to get to her seat." Derek turned his attention to Robert. "Sir, I need you to sit down and mind your own business." "This is everyone's business when you're being rude to passengers," said the woman from the row behind Victoria. Several other passengers murmured in agreement. Victoria could feel the tension in the cabin rising. As a business owner, she knew that situations like this could escalate quickly and affect everyone's travel experience. But as a pregnant woman being treated poorly, she was struggling to maintain her composure. "Look," Victoria said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I don't want any trouble. I just need to get back to my seat." Derek finally stepped aside, but not before making another comment. "People like you always want to cause drama," he said under his breath, but loud enough for Victoria to hear clearly. The words stung more than Victoria wanted to admit. She had faced discrimination before in business settings, but experiencing it as a customer on her own airline was particularly painful. She settled back into her seat, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to process what had just happened. Robert leaned over to her. "Are you okay?" That was completely unacceptable. "I'm fine," Victoria replied, though she wasn't sure if that was true. "Just tired?" The woman behind her tapped Victoria's shoulder gently. "I got some of that on video," she said quietly, "in case you want to file a complaint with the airline." Victoria thanked her but didn't mention that filing a complaint with herself would be a very short process. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started typing notes about everything that had happened. She was building a case not just against Derek, but for the kind of comprehensive training and policy changes that would prevent this from happening to other passengers. As the flight continued, Victoria noticed that Derek's behavior wasn't improving. She watched him ignore a call button from an elderly man who needed help opening his water bottle. She saw him roll his eyes when a mother asked for an extra cup for her toddler. Each incident was small on its own, but together they painted a picture of someone who had no business working in customer service. Patricia stopped by Victoria's row during one of her walks through the cabin. "How are you doing today? Can I get you anything?" The contrast between Patricia's genuine care and Derek's hostility was striking. Victoria smiled gratefully. "I'm doing well, thank you. You've been wonderful. Are you traveling for business or pleasure?" Patricia asked, engaging in the kind of friendly conversation that made flights more pleasant. "Business," Victoria replied. "I'm in the airline industry, actually." "Oh, how interesting. What do you do?" Victoria paused, choosing her words carefully. "I work in airline operations and customer experience." Patricia's face lit up. "Then you know how important it is to take care of passengers." "We try our best, though I have to admit some days are more challenging than others." Victoria could tell that Patricia was being diplomatic, but there was something in her tone that suggested she was aware of the issues with certain crew members. "I imagine dealing with difficult colleagues can be just as challenging as difficult passengers," Victoria said carefully. Patricia glanced around quickly, then leaned in slightly. "Between you and me, It can be really hard when not everyone on the team shares the same commitment to service. It affects the whole cabin atmosphere. Victoria nodded understandingly. I can imagine that creates a difficult work environment. It does. And it's not fair to passengers who expect consistent service throughout their flight experience. This conversation was as valuable to Victoria as anything else that had happened on the flight. She was learning that good employees like Patricia were aware of the problems and wanted to provide better service. But they were being undermined by colleagues like Derek. As Patricia moved on to check on other passengers, Victoria realized that addressing Derek's behavior wouldn't just improve customer satisfaction. It would also support employees who were trying to do their jobs well. The problem wasn't just one bad employee. It was a lack of accountability that was affecting the entire team dynamic. The plane began its descent into Denver, and Victoria prepared herself for whatever the rest of this flight might bring. She had a feeling her day was far from over. The plane was beginning its final descent into Denver when things took a turn that Victoria never could have anticipated. The captain had just announced that they would be landing in about 20 minutes, and passengers were starting to gather their belongings and prepare for arrival. Victoria pulled out her phone to check messages and make a few more notes about her flight experience. She had documented Derek's behavior throughout the flight, and she was already planning the conversations she would need to have with her human resources team and training department. As she typed, Derek appeared in the aisle beside her row, pushing the trash collection cart. He was moving more aggressively than necessary, banging into seats and clearly in a hurry to finish his duties. Phone needs to be put away, Derek said sharply to Victoria, though several other passengers around her were also using their devices. Victoria looked up confused. The captain didn't say anything about electronic devices, she replied politely. And we're still above 10,000 feet. Derek's face flushed with irritation. I don't need you to tell me the rules. Put the phone away now. Victoria glanced around and saw that at least a dozen other passengers were still using their phones and tablets. It was clear that Derek was singling her out for some reason. She decided to comply to avoid further confrontation. Of course, she said calmly, starting to power down her phone. But as she reached to put the phone in her purse, Derek suddenly grabbed her wrist. I said, put it away now, he shouted, his grip tightening on her arm. Victoria gasped in shock and pain. Let go of me, she said, trying to pull her arm free. You're hurting me. The physical contact sent a wave of panic through Victoria, not just for herself but for her unborn baby. She instinctively put her free hand on her belly protectively. Robert immediately stood up. Hey, take your hands off her right now. Other passengers began turning around and several people started recording the incident with their phones. The woman behind Victoria stood up as well, her phone already out and recording. Sir, you need to release her immediately, called out a businessman from across the aisle. Derek, realizing he had an audience, let go of Victoria's wrist but didn't step back. Instead, he seemed to get angrier. She was being uncooperative and refusing to follow instructions, Derek announced loudly, as if justifying his actions to the entire cabin. Victoria rubbed her wrist where Derek had grabbed her. She could already see red marks forming on her skin. I was putting my phone away, she said, her voice shaking slightly. There was no need to grab me. You people always play the victim, Derek said, his voice dripping with contempt. Always looking for something to complain about. The cabin fell silent. The phrase "you people" hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and everyone understood exactly what Derek meant by it. Robert stepped into the aisle, his teacher instincts kicking in. That's enough. I want to speak to the head flight attendant right now. So do I, said the businesswoman across the aisle. Victoria was trying to process what had just happened. Not only had Derek physically grabbed her while she was pregnant, but he had done so in front of a cabin full of witnesses who were now recording everything. As a business owner, she knew this was a disaster. As a woman and expectant mother, she was shaken and angry. I want to speak to the captain, Victoria said clearly, her voice carrying through the cabin. Derek laughed bitterly. The captain doesn't have time to deal with difficult passengers who can't follow simple instructions. Patricia appeared at the front of the aisle, having heard the commotion. Her face was pale as she took in the scene. Victoria holding her wrist, Derek standing aggressively in the aisle, and multiple passengers with their phones out recording. What's going on here? Patricia asked. though her tone suggested she already suspected Derek was at the center of whatever had happened. "Your colleague just physically grabbed this pregnant woman," Robert explained, his voice tight with anger. She was putting her phone away when he grabbed her wrist and started yelling at her. Patricia looked at Derek with an expression of disbelief and disappointment. "Derek, is this true?" "She was being uncooperative," Derek insisted. "I was just doing my job." "Your job doesn't include putting your hands on passengers," Patricia said firmly, "especially pregnant passengers." Victoria could see that Patricia was genuinely upset by what had happened. This gave her some hope that not all of her employees had lost sight of basic human decency. "I need to report this incident," Victoria said. "This is assault and I'm pregnant." "What he did could have hurt my baby," Derek scoffed. "Assault? I barely touched you." "You're being dramatic." The woman behind Victoria held up her phone. "I have the whole thing recorded." He grabbed her wrist and twisted it, and she clearly told him he was hurting her. Several other passengers confirmed they had also recorded the incident. Victoria realized that within hours, this video would probably be all over social media. Her airline's reputation was about to take a serious hit. "I want his name and employee number," Victoria said, pulling out a small notepad from her purse. "And I want to speak to whoever is in charge of this crew." Derek read her name from the passenger manifest on his device. "Victoria Williams," he said mockingly. "Good luck filing your little complaint, Victoria. Do you have any idea how many fake complaints we get from people like you?" The continued references to people like you were making other passengers increasingly uncomfortable. Victoria could see people shaking their heads and whispering among themselves. Patricia stepped between Derek and Victoria. "Derek, you need to return to the galley immediately. I'm handling this situation." "I don't take orders from you," Derek replied, his authority being challenged in front of passengers, clearly making him even angrier. "Actually, you do," Patricia said calmly but firmly. "I'm the lead flight attendant on this flight, and I'm telling you to step away from this passenger now." Victoria was impressed by Patricia's professionalism under pressure. Even in this tense situation, she was maintaining her composure and trying to de-escalate things. Derek looked around the cabin at all the passengers watching him. Multiple phones were still recording, and he seemed to realize for the first time that his behavior was being documented. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but he did step back toward the galley. Patricia turned to Victoria with genuine concern. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" Victoria examined her wrist. It was sore and there were visible red marks, but she didn't think it was seriously injured. However, the stress of the situation was making her feel anxious about the baby. "I think I'm okay," Victoria said, "but I'm concerned about the stress this might cause. I'm 7 months pregnant." "Of course," Patricia said understandingly. "We can have medical personnel meet the aircraft when we land if you'd like." Robert, who was still standing in the aisle, looked at Patricia with approval. "You're handling this exactly right, but that man should not be allowed near passengers for the rest of this flight." "I completely agree," Patricia said, "and I will be filing a report about this incident as soon as we land." Victoria looked around at the other passengers, many of whom were still holding their phones. She realized that this moment would define not just Derek's career, but potentially the future of her airline's culture and policies. "I appreciate your support," Victoria said to the passengers who had spoken up for her, "and I want everyone to know that this behavior is not acceptable, and it will have consequences." As the plane continued its descent, Victoria sat back in her seat, her mind racing. In less than an hour, she would be on the ground and Derek would discover exactly who he had just assaulted. But more importantly, she would have the opportunity to ensure that no other passenger would ever have to experience what she had just gone through. The irony wasn't lost on her. Derek had picked the wrong passenger to mistreat, but Victoria knew that any passenger would have been the wrong passenger. Every person on that plane deserved to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their background or status. Flight 447 touched down at Denver International Airport with a thud that seemed to punctuate the tension that had filled the cabin for the last hour. Victoria sat in her seat, still processing everything that had happened. Her wrist was sore and she was emotionally drained, but she was also filled with a sense of purpose. This experience had shown her exactly what needed to change in her company. As the plane taxied to the gate, Patricia made an announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at Denver International Airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the captain turns off the seatbelt sign. We want to thank you for flying with Skyward Airlines today." Victoria noticed that Patricia didn't give the usual cheerful closing remarks about hoping passengers would choose their airline again. Given what had just happened, she understood why. Derek had been conspicuously absent from the cabin for the remainder of the flight. Patricia had quietly informed Victoria that he had been instructed to remain in the galley and would not be interacting with passengers for the rest of the journey. As passengers began to gather their belongings, Robert turned to Victoria. "Are you sure you're okay? That was completely unacceptable behavior." "I'm fine, thank you so much for standing up for me," Victoria replied. "Not everyone would have gotten involved. My wife would never forgive me if I let someone treat a pregnant woman that way," Robert said with a smile. "Besides, I spent 30 years teaching high school. I know how to handle bullies." The woman behind Victoria leaned forward. "I've already uploaded the video to social media," she said. "I tagged Skyward Airlines too. People need to know about this." Victoria's stomach dropped a little. As much as she wanted accountability for Derek's actions, she also knew that viral videos could be devastating for businesses. She would need to get ahead of this situation quickly. Captain Rodriguez appeared at the front of the cabin, having left the cockpit once the plane was secured at the gate. He was a veteran pilot whom Victoria had personally recruited 2 years earlier from a major competitor. He started walking down the aisle, clearly looking for someone specific. When his eyes met Victoria's, his expression changed immediately from professional concern to recognition and alarm. "Ms. Williams?" he said, approaching her row. "I heard there was an incident on the flight. Are you all right?" The use of Victoria's name caught Derek's attention from the galley. He emerged and started walking toward the front of the cabin, probably expecting to finally see this difficult passenger get her comeuppance. But Patricia, who was closer to the captain, heard him address Victoria by name, and her eyes widened in realization. "Wait," Patricia said quietly to the captain. "Did you just call her Ms. Williams?" Captain Rodriguez nodded. "This is Victoria Williams, the CEO of Skyward Airlines." The words hit the cabin like a thunderbolt. The passengers who had witnessed the entire incident began murmuring in amazement. Robert's mouth fell open in surprise. Derek, who had been walking confidently toward the front of the plane, stopped dead in his tracks. The color drained from his face as the full meaning of what he was hearing sank in. "The CEO?" Derek whispered, though in the quiet cabin everyone could hear him. Victoria stood up slowly, her pregnancy making the movement deliberate and careful. She looked directly at Derek, who was now standing frozen in the aisle about 10 feet away from her. "Yes," Victoria said calmly. "I'm the CEO and owner of Skyward Airlines." The cabin was completely silent except for the sound of the jet engines winding down. Derek's face had gone from pale to ashen, and Victoria could see his hands shaking. "I was traveling incognito today to get a first-hand look at the passenger experience on our flights," Victoria continued, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "I wanted to see how our customers are really treated when they fly with us." Captain Rodriguez stepped closer to Victoria. "Ma'am, Patricia briefed me on what happened. I'm horrified that you experienced this on one of our flights, and as a passenger on your own airline." Derek tried to speak but could only manage a stammered apology. I didn't know. I mean, if I had known who you were." Victoria looked at him with disappointment rather than anger. "That's exactly the problem, Derek. You didn't know who I was, so you felt it was acceptable to treat me poorly. But every passenger deserves the same respect, whether they're the CEO or someone flying for the first time." The passengers were watching this exchange with fascination. Several were still recording, realizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Robert stood up and extended his hand to Victoria. "Well, I'll be damned. It's an honor to meet you, Ms. Williams, and I have to say, what I witnessed today was absolutely unacceptable. But your response shows exactly the kind of leader this industry needs." Victoria shook his hand warmly. "Thank you, Robert, and thank you for standing up for what was right. That meant more to me than you'll ever know." The woman behind Victoria also introduced herself. "I'm Karen Thompson, and I'm a travel blogger. I have to ask, what are you going to do about this?" Victoria considered the question carefully. She knew that her response would be widely shared and would set the tone for how her company handled this crisis. "First," Victoria said, "I want to make sure that Mr. Derek Reynolds understands that his employment with Skyward Airlines is terminated immediately." Derek's legs seemed to give out slightly, and he had to steady himself against a seat. "Please," he said desperately. "I have a family. I need this job. I'm sorry, I really am." Victoria looked at him with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Derek, you physically grabbed a pregnant passenger, made discriminatory comments, and created a hostile environment for everyone on this flight. Your apology only came after you learned who I was. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Patricia stepped forward. "Ms. Williams, I want you to know that not all of us share Derek's attitude. Most of our crew members are dedicated professionals who care about our passengers." "I know that, Patricia," Victoria replied. "You've been wonderful throughout this flight, and you handled this situation with exactly the professionalism and care I expect from our team members." Captain Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "Patricia is one of our best flight attendants. Her conduct today was exemplary under very difficult circumstances." Victoria looked around at the passengers, who were all listening intently. "I also want to address everyone else on this flight. You've witnessed something that should never happen on any airline, but especially not on mine. You stood up for what was right and you documented what happened. That takes courage, and I'm grateful." Karen, the travel blogger, raised her hand. "What changes will you make to prevent this from happening again?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, thinking about the comprehensive changes that would be needed. "We're going to completely overhaul our hiring and training processes. We're going to implement stronger accountability measures and create better ways for passengers to report problems. And we're going to make sure that every employee understands that discrimination and mistreatment of passengers will result in immediate termination." Derek, who had been standing silently during this exchange, suddenly seemed to find his voice again. "You can't fire me for this. I was just doing my job." She was being difficult. The passengers who had witnessed the entire incident began speaking up in Victoria's defense. "She was doing nothing wrong," Robert said firmly. "You grabbed her wrist and made racist comments," added Karen. "I got it all on video," said another passenger. "You were completely out of line." Victoria held up her hand for quiet. "Derek, you assaulted a pregnant passenger, made discriminatory remarks, and created an unsafe environment. Your actions were caught on multiple videos and witnessed by an entire cabin full of people. You're lucky that criminal charges are the only other consequence you might face." As the gate agent announced that passengers could begin deplaning, Victoria gathered her belongings. She knew that the next few hours would be crucial for her company's reputation and future. "Captain Rodriguez," she said, "I'll need to speak with you and Patricia as soon as we're off the aircraft. We have a lot of work to do." As passengers began filing off the plane, many of them stopped to speak with Victoria, expressing their support and their appreciation for how she had handled the situation. Derek remained seated, staring at his hands, the full weight of what he had done and what it would cost him finally sinking in. Victoria was the last to leave the aircraft. As she walked up the jet bridge, she was already planning the changes that would ensure no passenger would ever have to experience what she had just been through. 3 months later, Victoria Williams sat in her office at Skyward Airlines headquarters, her newborn daughter sleeping peacefully in a bassinet beside her desk. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating awards and recognition certificates that had arrived in recent weeks from various civil rights organizations and passenger advocacy groups. The events of Flight 447 had indeed gone viral, but not in the way Victoria had initially feared. Instead of destroying her airline's reputation, the incident had become a powerful example of leadership, accountability, and positive change in the aviation industry. Karen Thompson's travel blog post about the incident had been shared over 1 million times. But it wasn't just the story of Derek's misconduct that captured people's attention. It was Victoria's response, her grace under pressure, her commitment to treating all passengers with dignity, and most importantly, the sweeping changes she implemented in the wake of the incident. Derek Reynolds had been terminated immediately, as Victoria had promised. He had also been charged with assault, and while he ultimately received probation and community service, he was banned from working for any airline. The incident had effectively ended his career in aviation, but Victoria had focused her energy on positive changes rather than dwelling on punishment. In the 3 months since the flight, Skyward Airlines had become a model for customer service excellence and workplace accountability. The first change was a complete overhaul of the hiring process. Victoria had partnered with diversity and inclusion consultants to develop new screening procedures that identified not just technical qualifications, but also character traits like empathy, cultural sensitivity, and genuine service orientation. Ms. Williams, Patricia knocked on the office door. Since the Denver incident, Patricia had been promoted to Director of Customer Experience, a new position Victoria had created to ensure passenger concerns were addressed at the highest levels of the company. "Come in." "Patricia," Victoria said, carefully adjusting her sleeping daughter. "How did the training session go this morning?" Patricia smiled as she entered the office. "Excellent. We had 50 new flight attendants complete the Customer Service Excellence program. The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. The new training program was comprehensive, covering not just safety procedures and service standards, but also unconscious bias de-escalation techniques, and the importance of treating every passenger with respect regardless of their background, appearance, or ticket class." "And the anonymous reporting system?" Victoria asked. "We've received over 200 reports in the past 3 months," Patricia replied. "Most of them have been positive feedback about crew members going above and beyond for passengers. But we've also identified and addressed several situations where employees needed additional coaching, or in a few cases, discipline." Victoria nodded with satisfaction. The anonymous reporting system allowed passengers and employees to report both positive and negative experiences without fear of retaliation. It had become an invaluable tool for identifying problems before they escalated and recognizing employees who exemplified the company's values. Robert, the retired teacher from Flight 447, had become an unexpected ally in Victoria's reform efforts. He had reached out to her after the incident and volunteered to help develop training materials based on his decades of experience managing difficult classroom situations. His modules on conflict de-escalation and cultural sensitivity had become standard parts of the Skyward Airlines training program. "There's someone here to see you," Patricia said. "It's a surprise, but a good one." A moment later, Captain Rodriguez entered the office, followed by the entire crew from Flight 447. Except, of course, for Derek. They were all smiling and carrying flowers and baby gifts. "We wanted to meet the newest member of the Skyward Airlines family," Captain Rodriguez said, looking at Victoria's daughter, "and to thank you for everything you've done for this company." Lisa, one of the flight attendants from that day, stepped forward. "Ms. Williams, you could have responded to what happened with anger and blame. Instead, you used it as an opportunity to make all of us better at our jobs and to create a workplace we're proud to be part of." Victoria felt tears welling up in her eyes. "You all stood up for what was right that day. You made me proud to be associated with this team." The crew members took turns holding the baby and sharing stories about how the changes at Skyward Airlines had affected their work. They talked about feeling more confident in their roles, having better tools to handle difficult situations, and seeing genuine improvements in passenger satisfaction. "The customers are different too," Patricia observed. "Word has gotten out about our commitment to passenger respect and dignity. We're attracting travelers who specifically choose us because of our values." This was true. Skyward Airlines had seen a significant increase in bookings, particularly among travelers who had felt unwelcome or mistreated by other airlines. The company's stock price had risen substantially, and they were expanding to new routes faster than originally planned. Karen Thompson had become a regular passenger and informal ambassador for the airline. Her follow-up blog posts documenting the changes at Skyward Airlines had helped spread the word about the company's transformation. "There's something else," Captain Rodriguez said, pulling out a folder. "The Federal Aviation Administration wants to use our training programs as a model for industry-wide standards. They're considering making some of our customer service requirements mandatory for all airlines." Victoria's eyes widened in surprise and pride. "Really? Really? What you started on that flight to Denver is changing the entire industry." As the crew members left to return to their duties, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The incident with Derek had been traumatic and infuriating, but it had also been a catalyst for positive change that extended far beyond her own company. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her assistant announcing that a reporter from a major news magazine was on the line, wanting to interview her about the airline industry's response to customer service issues. "Put them through," Victoria said, adjusting her daughter in her arms. "Ms. Williams." The reporter's voice came through clearly. I'm calling because Skyward Airlines has become synonymous with passenger rights and dignity in air travel. Can you tell me what inspired these changes?" Victoria looked down at her sleeping daughter and thought about the world she was creating for her to grow up in. A world where people were judged by their character rather than their appearance. Where accountability mattered, and where everyone was treated with fundamental human dignity. "It started with a flight to Denver," Victoria began, "where I learned that creating positive change sometimes requires experiencing the problem firsthand. But more importantly, I learned that when good people see injustice, they have a choice. They can look away or they can speak up and demand better." As she continued the interview, sharing the story of Flight 447 and its aftermath, Victoria realized that the incident that had seemed so devastating at the time had actually been a gift. It had shown her exactly what needed to be fixed, given her the motivation to fix it, and provided a clear example of what her company stood for. Derek's actions had been meant to diminish and humiliate her, but instead they had become the foundation for positive change that was spreading throughout the entire aviation industry. Sometimes, Victoria reflected, the most powerful response to discrimination and disrespect was not anger or revenge, but the determination to create a world where such behavior could never happen again. Her daughter stirred in her arms and opened her eyes, looking up at her mother with the clear, trusting gaze of someone who expected the world to be a good and fair place. Victoria smiled down at her. "Don't worry, little one," she whispered. "By the time you're old enough to fly, things are going to be much better." Outside her office window, a Skyward Airlines plane was taking off, carrying passengers who could expect to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of who they were or where they were going. It was a small but meaningful step toward the kind of world Victoria wanted her daughter to inherit.